Good afternoon. Welcome to our first event in our Critical Conversation series for spring 2021. My name is Eula Taylor, and I'm honored to serve as the chairperson for the Department of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley. Our Critical Conversation series is organized around two themes: the celebration of the life and legacy of Professor Barbara Christian, and exploring the concept of abolition democracy. Our department is able to bring you this series largely because we have received financial support around these two themes and our Futures of Black Studies vision. Before we begin our conversation, I want to introduce to you two of my colleagues, Professors Nikki Jones and Lee Rayford, who will provide a snapshot of our two major initiatives. Professor Jones?
Thank you, Professor Taylor, and good afternoon, and thank you to our panelists for joining us today, and to all of you out there who have signed on to listen and join the conversation. We are very excited to kick off our department's Critical Conversation series, which is supported by the Black Studies Collaboratory, which Professor Rayford will talk about more in a moment, and the Abolition Democracy Initiative, which we've taken to calling the ADI around the department. So the ADI and the Black Studies Collaboratory will work together in a synergistic way to center and respond to the most pressing questions of the moment, questions that are perhaps new to some, but that we understand as enduring questions about Black freedom and the ongoing project of abolition. With support from the Office of the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Chancellor's Office, and our Dean Rocka Ray, the ADI builds on the work of W.B. Du Bois and Angela Davis in an effort to support and amplify the work of academics and activists who are actively imagining and building a world in which policing and prisons are obsolete. To this end, the ADI supports collaborative, community-oriented, anti-racist, and interdisciplinary research that centers Black humanity and critical epistemologies like the Black radical and Black feminist traditions. The ADI also supports public engagement and conversations like this one today, conversations that we hope will invite, inspire, and positively impact members of our department, the campus community, and our community beyond the boundaries of campus. The department's Critical Conversation series will stand as an open invitation to join some of the most important conversations of the moment through the gateway of Black studies. We hope that these conversations will inspire you to commit or recommit to the important and unfinished work of building up the life-affirming institutions and relationships that we need in this time. We look forward to the work and the conversations ahead. And with that, I will turn it over to my brilliant colleague and the program director for the Black Studies Collaboratory, Professor Lee Rayford.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Eula. Thank you all for being here. I am Lee Rayford. I am proud to be the inaugural director of the Black Studies Collaboratory, which is the recipient of a Mellon Foundation Just Futures initiative, a collaborative effort to address racial inequality through bold and unique humanities-based research projects that seek to expand the collective understanding of America's history. Our work over the next 3 years in the Black Studies Collaboratory will involve think tanks, summer labs for graduate students, research grants for faculty and students, and a university course open to the public. We will culminate our program with a Black Futures retreat organized in collaboration with a host of community partners. And our work together for the next 3 years is to amplify the interdisciplinary, political, and world-building work of Black studies. For us, Black studies is at heart a life-affirming field centered in Black humanity, and our goals for the Black Studies Collaboratory for today, for our talk today, and I think for our work more broadly in the department, is to provide space for critical engagement and collaborative dreaming, to create opportunities for joyful and generative engagement among Black faculty, students, staff, the surrounding community, and around the country. I am thrilled that so many of you have joined us today as we take the opportunity to really just think about where we've come from and what we carry forth with us. And with that, I will hand it back to wonderful Eula Taylor.
Thank you, professors. We appreciate you and your generous leadership. I have to tell you, Nikki and Lee are awesome. And I am really, really excited to serve as your moderator today. And I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists as well. I will read their bios in the order of their presentations. Professors Arlene Kaiser, Fred Moten, Lisa Zay Winters, and Xavier Livermond. Each panelist will speak independently for about 8 minutes, and then we'll come back together for a conversation that will include questions submitted on the registration forms. In between, I'm going to do my best to read some of the testimonies about Professor Christian that were also submitted on the registration forms. So here we go. Professor Arlene Kaiser is a scholar, writer, and teacher whose work focuses primarily on African diaspora literature and culture, engaging critical theory, feminist theory, especially Black feminist theory, and psychoanalysis. Kaiser earned her doctorate in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, where she studied with Barbara Christian. The author of the book Black Subjects, Identity Formations in the Contemporary Narrative of Slavery, as well as the co-editor of New Black Feminist Criticisms, 1985 to 2000, a collection of Christian essays published by the University of Illinois Press in 2007. From 2017 until 2020, Kaiser served as the chairperson of the Department of Humanities and Media Studies at Pratt Institute. Kaiser holds currently a Mellon Foundation-sponsored fellowship at Olin College of Engineering. Our second speaker is Professor Fred Moten, who works in the Department of Performance in the Tisch School of Arts at NYU. His fields are Black studies and critical poetics, and his concern especially around the entanglement of social movement and aesthetic experiment. Over the last 20 years, Moten has addressed this concern in a number of books of poetry and criticism, including In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, and B. Jenkins, which is personally my favorite. Deeply committed to collaborative work, Moten is also co-author with Stefano Harney of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, and the forthcoming, also co-written with Harney, All Incomplete. Moten is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions, and most recently was named a 2020 MacArthur Fellow. Our third presenter is Professor Lisa Zay Winters, who is an associate professor of African American Studies and English at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Currently, she is consumed with the day-to-day practice of mothering a Black girl in the time of now. And her current research interests center on Black motherhood and radical Black love and the possibilities therein for imagining and enacting freedom for Black children. She is the author of The Mulatta Concubine, Terror, Intimacy, Freedom, and Desire in the Black Transatlantic. Our fourth speaker is Xavier Livermond, an associate professor of feminist studies and core faculty in critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He has published widely in the fields of African popular culture and African queer studies. His recent book, Koweïto Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, discusses the rise of post-apartheid South African popular culture and its articulation with contemporary politics of race, gender, and sexuality. He is currently working on a project examining Black queer belonging in South Africa. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Arlene Kaiser.
Okay. Thanks so much, Eula. I'm honored to have been invited to participate in this session and series. I want to thank Eula Taylor, Nikki Jones, and Lee Rayford, and all those working with them to bring this to fruition. I'd like to begin my brief remarks with the words of Edouard Glissant, the Caribbean theorist, playwright, and novelist. This is the first slide. In Caribbean Discourse, Glissant writes, "We dream of what we will cultivate in the future, and we wonder vaguely what the new hybrid that is already being prepared for us will look like, since in any case, we will not rediscover them as they were, the magnolias of former times." I call this mini presentation, "What Barbara Knew That You Should Know." Since Barbara's written work is a legacy available to all of us, I thought I would take this opportunity to share with you some of the things I learned from her that aren't written down anywhere, as far as I know. I don't think of these as secrets. I imagine that other scholars who worked with her were privy to this knowledge as well. Instead, I offer these as Barbara's insights into the nature of doing Black studies in historically white institutions of higher education and publishing, insights she was keen to pass on to those in the generation after her. Thinking of Barbara as a magnolia of former times, a Caribbean magnolia, is an answering metaphor. A serious gardener, Barbara thought of her doctoral students as flowers and nicknamed us according to the bloom she thought each most resembled. In the early 1990s, when I began the process of applying for dissertation grants in order to have some time away from grad student teaching to focus and finish, Barbara told me that throughout her entire career, and remember, at this point, she was already a full professor and one of the celebrated founders of Black feminist criticism, she had never been awarded a major fellowship for her scholarly work, not from ACLS, not from Guggenheim, not from a major humanities institute. None of those institutions had invited her into their ranks with fellowship funding that would have freed her from a semester or a year of teaching and mentoring. Barbara did not tell me this with bitterness, nor was she trying to dissuade me from applying. She was trying to make sure I understood how the profession at large viewed Black feminist perspectives at that time. She was warning me that however much I might have felt I needed the money or the validation from such funders, a vote of confidence from such sources did not matter to the nature and purpose of my work itself. She knew where I came from culturally and academically, and she was trying to make sure I understood that substituting the values of elite, historically white universities and foundations for my own values and those incubated within Black studies, gender studies, ethnic studies, and the many strands of radical social critique would be deadly to my work and my life. The second thing that Barbara told me in this vein was that Black Women Novelists, her celebrated first book, was published by the 27th press to which she submitted it. It could have been the 28th, but I remember 27. In other words, the idea of a tradition among Black women writers was not legible at all to major academic publishers in the late 1970s. Indeed, the idea that literature written by Black women was worthy of scholarly study was rejected over and over again in the early careers of the pioneering scholars in African-American literary studies in historically white colleges and universities. Of course, this was true in many other areas of Black studies as well, as in ethnic studies, as in gender studies. In other words, the same publishing houses now snapping up and foregrounding radical Black scholarship rejected this work almost entirely just 35 to 40 years ago. This is a cautionary tale and not a tale of glorious progress. Many of us trying to do our versions of Black studies in the 21st century have easier avenues to publication than Barbara did. Some of us do not. Our voices are sometimes amplified by the megaphones of major presses or university positions or scholarly awards. But Barbara's concerns that the gatekeepers of these institutions might define what work in Black studies makes it into public view and is most highly valued, both outside and within our field, those concerns are even more pressing now than they were in the 1990s. I am concerned that the current situation in which some Black Studies scholars have access to major university presses and trade presses, partly because of being situated in elite research universities, and partly because of a socio-historical moment in which there appears to be an appetite for work that foregrounds Black freedom struggles, will be understood as normative. I'm concerned about the way that the work of the most successful among us, in traditional academic terms, is being held up by outside gatekeepers as a standard within our field. I'm worried about a future in which the fruits of individual success for Black Studies faculty will replace a collective notion of the success of the field as a site of rigorous and socially engaged inquiry. And I need hardly say that the projects undertaken in critical conversations are obviously against this trend. They're supportive of the field as a collective practice. Whether we do Black Studies in departments of African American and African diaspora studies, or from other locations within the mainstream academy, I believe we find ourselves in roughly the same position that Barbara and her path-breaking generation did. Black Studies is still an outsider within the traditional academy, though it wears many more laurels on its brow. Over the past 40 years, the theoretical, critical, and historical work emerging from Black studies, gender studies, and ethnic studies has changed the way scholarship is carried out throughout the humanities and social sciences. Nevertheless, the scholarly legitimacy of our academic units or concentrations within traditional departments continues to be questioned, and every 5 years or so, we're asked to account for our very existence. The questions we still face are those that Barbara posed with characteristic acumen and clarity in her last essays. How do we use the joy of our intellectual and creative labors to counter the exhaustion produced by our struggles for equity in historically white academia and academic publishing? How do we use the generative force of our outsider within status for our own benefit in ways that will help our students thrive in these institutions? I celebrate Barbara's commitment and ability to work productively in every sphere of the university, in professional organizations, and in many community settings, while registering the exorbitant cost of that labor, the extraordinary stress that was the condition of her professional existence and remains the condition of many of our professional lives. I'm cautiously hopeful about the hybrids we are cultivating in Black Studies, because we certainly will not encounter again our magnolia of former times. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please show some love. Yes. Thank you so much, Arlene. Professor Moten.
I'm very proud and grateful to have been invited by you, Professor Taylor, and your colleagues to remember Barbara Christian here today with all of you. But I can't help but feel like it should be my old schoolmates, Gabrielle Foreman or Sandra Gunning, eminent scholars who, like Professors Kaiser, Livermond, Winters, and Taylor, and so many others, work closely with Professor Christian, that you should be listening to right now, not me. At the same time, I'm conscious of how it's possible to be someone's student even if you never took a class from them, even if your intimacy with them is confined to, but also released in, having tried to read them and to read along with them from the small but unbridgeable distance between Wheeler Hall, where the English department remains, and Dwinell Hall, where African American studies used to be, and from the large but somehow more traversable distance between, say, 1990 and today. Though I never took a class from her, I nevertheless was able to breathe in the atmosphere Professor Christian somehow helped to sustain at Berkeley in the late 80s and early 90s, and to work and study and play, a word she uses pointedly and to which I want to return, under her protection, which she enacted only seemingly paradoxically by leaving the Berkeley English department in the years immediately preceding my matriculation there. In leaving that department, she didn't leave behind the Black students who came to that department in search of her and in her wake. Folks like Professors Gunning and Foreman and Eleanor Branch, Keith Harris and Francesca Royster and me, all engaged and remain engaged in various modalities of following in her footsteps, not only from Wheeler to Dwinell, but also in those of Professor Christian's footsteps, which modeled an exodus that we have sought and continue to seek to carry out and carry on as a practice of abolition. One way to understand Professor Christian's refusal of the English department is as a non-local instantiation of that same impulse that led the writer then called James Ngugi, along with his colleagues Oluwar Anyumba and Taban Lo Leong, to call in the late 60s for the abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi and by extension everywhere. At the same time, Ngugi and his colleagues' assertion of a shift from a Department of English to a Department of Literature parallels and echoes another shift Professor Christian had already been involved in before coming to Berkeley, when she and others like June Jordan, Audre Lorde, and Adrienne Rich, teachers of composition to the supposedly ineducable Black and brown working class students of the city of New York who tried to take advantage of open admissions to that city's university, began to serve those students by finding the way back into the ground of literature, which is literacy, but a literacy informed by sound, by orality and orality, by the sensuality of communal experience. In that moment and all throughout her career, Professor Christian bore the standard for a Pan-African cultural insurgency, which allowed, in her particular and special case, a flourishing exfoliation of literature in the wake of the digging, the tilling, the careful gardening of its conditions of possibility. Along with, but in a specifically feminist disruption and augmentation of her contemporary Walter Rodney, Professor Christian's groundings with her sisters and brothers taught us all how to read. Though I am here, then, I hope, to represent the vast majority of her students, those who never took a class from her, I am blessed to be able to say that I breathed air that she made possible and that I heard the beautiful and critical and insightful sound of her own breathing on a special occasion or two, like the day when she delivered the lecture that we now know as the Race for Theory, or the evening when she debated Ishmael Reed on the significance of the color purple, illuminating for him and for their audience the difference between Alice Walker's novel and Steven Spielberg's film. Of course, it has been for me and for most of us in her writing where the sound of her voice, so often attuned to the sound of our treasured writers as they record the sounds of the Black social life that they treasure, comes through in what she called layered rhythms, in a polyrhythmic complexity that demands her readers play with what she and they read together. This is how Professor Christian reads, accompanies, and complements Toni Morrison, refusing the distinction between criticism and fiction precisely so that we can see how Morrison, in her turn, plays with and against Virginia Woolf, and so that we, Christian's readers, can join the choir she has joined and amplified, as it is itself in search of what she calls the chorus of the community, living and dead, that bears us and that we all bear. Listen closely to Professor Christian talking with Morrison until you get ready to line it out and sound it out, because reading doesn't get any more beautiful than this. And she writes, in your work, as in Virginia's inner time, as in Virginia's, inner time is always transforming outer time through memory. But since memory is not only individual, but merges with others to create a communal memory, outer time also transforms inner time. It is that reciprocity between the individual inner and the communal outer which your work seeks. The folk's time, however, is not mechanical time, the march of years, which your chapters in Sula mock, but time as it marks an event in human society, but also in nature, which for you includes the folk as much as it means the seasons. The mythic quality of your worlds seems to be in opposition to many people's concept of human history, when in fact, history and myth have always been related. Myth being a central part of any people's history. History itself creating myth, time, and timelessness in dialogue. At her own unique, but still ensemblic intersection of myth and history, Professor Christian brings the question of the world online. Right here, from everywhere we gather, at the end of this world and the beginning of every other, it's cool to be together in the place Barbara Christian chose. Right now, but timelessly, as we head off into the future she still builds for us, Barbara Christian is right on time.
Thank you so much, Fred. Let's show Fred some love. Yes. Thank you so very, very much. And for all of you out there, I just want to share that we're going to have Gabrielle Foreman in the fall, who's going to continue our conversation in terms of honoring Professor Barbara Christian, and hopefully we'll all be on campus at that time. Our next speaker is Professor Lisa Zay Winters.
Okay, hello. Yes, it's such a privilege and an honor to be here with all of you to celebrate Dr. Christian's legacy. I'm so grateful for the invitation from Dr. Taylor, Dr. Rayford, Dr. Jones, the African American Studies Department, and you all have a whole team. It's kind of amazing coming from a place where I am, where our department definitely has been siloed in certain ways. It's a beautiful thing to see the fruition of your labor being supported in such robust ways. From my bachelor's degree through my PhD, all of my degrees are from this Department of African American Studies. It's home to me. I grew up here. It has shaped how I move in this world for sure. And Professor Christian was a critical part of this journey. So I'm so thankful to be part of this celebration. Here's the memory I want to share. The first class I ever took from Barbara Christian as an undergraduate, I earned a B+. The second class I took from her, I had to ask for an incomplete. I was not a stellar student. I needed an incomplete because that semester I had gone through a breakup and could not get myself together to finish my final papers for all of my courses. So there's not a single word for me that can hold Dr. Christian's presence as a professor. The way she carried herself in her seemingly effortless style of lecturing that was not lecturing, but the storytelling that took you places. She conveyed knowledge, a wisdom, a grace, a spiritual depth that intimidated me. So I was extra nervous to ask her for an incomplete. I reminded myself she could say yes or she could say no, and that would be that. There was no email to follow up then. But here's what happened. She asked me if she could ask me why, what was going on in my life that made me not be able to complete the course. I was mortified. Here I was already 22 and felt like I should know better, but instead I knew nothing. The breakup had been horrible. It was deeply humiliating. And me telling you all this story notwithstanding, I'm an extremely private and very shy person. And I also felt really what was going on and what I was going through didn't matter to anybody but me. And all Dr. Christian knew was that I had earned a B+ in one class with her. And here I was asking for an incomplete for another. And all I knew was that she was magnificent. And so how was I going to tell her I couldn't do the basic thing of writing a final paper because I was sad? These were the thoughts in my head. I know I looked down at the floor when I answered and told her. And then she said, and I believe, but I could not swear that I'm quoting verbatim, but this is definitely what I heard and felt and what I remember and I hold, is that she said, that's one of the hardest things you can go through. That's my Barbara Christian story. I wasn't her greatest student. I wasn't one of the fortunate and definitely smarter than me many who broke bread with her at her house or walked her back to her office after class or bonded with her through conversations on the phone. But I think that that's what matters. She saw you even if you didn't know you were seen. And the grace she extended me in that moment, I've carried with me since. And what I understand now too is that this is part of the work of what it means to be a professor, and it's overwhelming. As Black women, we carry this work disproportionately in the academy. The stakes are so high for us and for our students. And I think too, how often the conversations about how we shouldn't have to do this work, how it's not valued, how it diminishes our intellect and expertise. But it is such necessary work. And this word work, right, with Barbara. Barbara insisted we call the books and the stories and the plays and the poems and the essays she taught us, she insisted we call these objects work, not texts, work. She was so clear on naming not just the labor, but the person who endeavored to create these worlds we read in her classes. This work is sacred. And what I learned from Barbara too in that day, where she refused to let me feel small and alone. What I learned from her is that for this work to matter, it must be done in community. What I learned from her was a radical refusal of emotional and spiritual distance from the work we do as scholars and teachers. So it matters that Ray Paris, whose poem, An Open Letter of Love to Black Students, Black Lives Matter, is a most radical act of Black love. Ray Paris is Barbara's student. It matters that Maisha Priest, whose achingly beautiful essay, Salvation is the Issue, is both a profoundly personal and insistently collective act of grief and resistance. Maisha Priest is Barbara's student. It matters that Kelly Navies, who is the oral history coordinator for the Blacksonian, and so is making sure that Black folks' stories are remembered and revered in their own words, is Barbara's student. It matters that when I came into Barbara's office to ask for an incomplete, feeling trifling and embarrassed that I wasn't that strong Black woman I thought we were all supposed to be. It wasn't just me who sat there in front of her. This is the work. So I thank Barbara and thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much. I felt that. Thank you. Now I would like to turn it over to Professor Livermond.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm still in a bit of an emotional state, so excuse me if I'm a little shaky. Lisa, thank you for that offering. I want to just start, of course, by thanking the Department of African American Studies and Professor Taylor, Rayford, and Jones for the invitation. I also want to take this time to thank my fellow panelists as well for participating and giving us their offerings today, as well as all of you who are part of our audience. Together we make this space, and so I appreciate you all being here today. I also just want to say that I'm the baby here in the sense that I was the last person, as far as chronologically to have the experience of being taught by and in the orbit of Dr. Christian. And so it is an honor um, to be here today to be able to speak to her legacies, but also to understand how impactful that legacy was. Um, oh, sorry, people can't hear me. Trying to raise my volume. Is it better?
I can hear you.
Okay, okay. So, so I just want to start by once again, like others, sharing a memory. And that memory really was that memory of the phone call that Barbara gave me to encourage me to come and to the department. And I just remember the voice, right? And it's heft and its weight, but also its um, the, the way it gave me a sense of security in such a short moment. And I said, oh, I have to be here, and I have to be with this person who expresses their confidence in me, not even really knowing me, right? And I remember the experience of being in her African diaspora feminisms course. And I admit I came in there with so little knowledge, but I was never made to feel small, like I didn't have the knowledge. I came in there with these very basic understandings of questions of Blackness and feminism and race and gender and sexuality. And through her loving and critical and careful instruction, I came away from that class with something very different. And it really truly was the foundation of my work. I'll just recall that I discussed with her The Best Man. I don't know if you guys remember that movie, but it came out that semester while we were in class. And we were just sitting there having one of those Barbara conversations. We're just sitting there in an office and you're just talking about your impressions of the film. And then she tells me, you know what, that sounds real good. I think you should write something about that. And so I went home, I wrote something and I sent it to her. And she gave me all this feedback and just said, you know what, you can publish this. You should, pull it together, publish it. And I didn't end up doing anything with that. But two things came out of that. It was as I said, that confidence that she had in my voice, that gift of trusting my voice and encouraging me to think that I actually could do this work. And while I didn't do anything with that essay, it ultimately was the basis of me beginning to think of myself seriously as a scholar, and to think of myself seriously as someone who could do cultural criticism. And I think that a lot of the beginnings of that ended up coming through in my work subsequently. Um, just to talk about the critical importance of the work in this moment, I just want to think about how Barbara was always so attentive to narrative. And she always felt that narrative was such a key way for us to think about ourselves as Black folk. And it was such a key way to theorize. It was such a key way to do methods. It was such a key way of thinking. And I think in this moment of Black studies, when we are trying to think about methods, theories, ways of moving through the world, I just want to remember how seriously the kinds of storytelling, the narratives that we've created as Black people infuse our work, and infuse our work in very critical ways. And then lastly, I just want to say something about the way that Barbara um, really critically supported queer faculty, queer students, and queer inquiry. Um, these were things that, of course, I vaguely knew were possible. But it was through Barbara that I began to understand that I could make that kind of intervention. And not only that, but that I could do it in Black studies. And so I didn't have to go somewhere else to do that. And I'm remembering an essay that she wrote about this tension between Black studies and women's studies, that really didn't need to be a tension, right? And I think that suffused the way that she gave me, the way that she gave me that strength to do the work. And the last thing I just want to say is that part of Barbara's brilliance is that you realize that she's still teaching you 20 and 30 years later. There was so much that I got out of my very brief opportunity to be with her before she fell ill, um, that I just didn't even realize until now. Like there were things where I'm talking to a graduate and student, and then I realized, oh, that's what Barbara was doing with me,
Mhm.
what she meant. There were times when I'm standing in front of the classroom and I'm like, oh, that's why she did this way. I understood finally. And I think that her mentorship often was in many ways the the gift that she gave, and then the way that those of us who've been mentored by that pass that forward in our own mentorship. And so with that, I just think that I just want to, once again, I think, hope that we have this space for reflection. I think take very seriously the body of work and its impact. And I just want to reiterate, how privileged I feel to be a part of this conversation and to be able to share these memories. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Xavier. Show some love. Wow, I'm sure all of you out there have been deeply moved the way that I have been by these heartfelt memories of our beloved Barbara Christian. As we engage in the conversation, I'm going to just share some of the comments that came in earlier, as well as to let you all know who some of the folks are listening today. And I first want to acknowledge Najuma, Barbara's daughter. And she is with us today. And I have no doubt, Lisa, when I was reading your bio about the mothering, that it spoke to Najuma, who's also mothering and engaging in remote teaching at this time. So we're so glad that you're with us, Najuma, today. I'm also going to be very careful and not provide last names unless the person is identified as a professor at a public institution. So I just want you to be aware of that. I think it will be interesting just to kind of co-sign what Xavier just shared by Marlon Bailey. And Marlon Bailey wrote that, who graduated in 2005 and currently is a professor at Arizona State University in the Women and Gender Studies and African American Studies Department. That, quote, I was fortunate to have been recruited by Barbara Christian to the Ph.D. program in 1999. I was a part of the last cohort. She taught a class, African Diaspora Feminisms, and the course changed my life. Barbara's graduate seminar had about 30 students in it. Can you imagine a graduate seminar with 30 students in it? That was Barbara Christian. And in that class, students were exposed to Black feminist literature and theory, and Barbara's pedagogy was transformative. In addition, during this first year, Barbara arranged for Dr. Livermond and Dr. Bailey to do an independent study in Black queer studies with another PhD candidate in ethnic studies. Barbara was the professor of record for this course. Together, they put together a 2-volume course packet for the course and crafted a syllabus. This course experience was foundational for Professor Bailey. Professor Bailey says, I owe much of my success as a Black queer studies scholar to Barbara Christian and African American studies and gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley. There is nothing more powerful than a master teacher. And Barbara Christian was a master teacher in the classroom, and she also was a master teacher via her work, her scholarship. I'm so glad, Lisa, that you shared about the whole idea of calling it work. I'm going to remember that because it is. And I was wondering if we can begin by talking about Barbara's work and how Barbara's work and the language that she used was so personal and heartfelt. And I think this is one of the reasons why it continues to resonate with us 20 years after her passing. And one of the questions that we received states, I think of Barbara Christian's assertion that what I write and how I write is an affirmation that sensuality is intelligence, that sensual language is language that makes sense. How do we all think about and use sensual language in your creative work, in your critical work? What is the role of sensual language in the future of Black studies? So, would anyone like to open up the conversation around sensual language in your own work, perhaps?
I'm willing to speak a bit on this. I mean, I'm so moved by the recollections of Barbara, especially from Xavier and from Lisa, because one of the things I remember most powerfully about meeting Barbara and entering graduate school was that she understood that I was coming in as primarily thinking of myself as a poet. Like I had previously gotten a creative writing degree. I was still writing poetry and studying poetry during the time I was a graduate student. And one of the things she wanted me to understand was that I should not lose the voice that I had as I was entering graduate school. I can't say that I was able to adhere to that. I feel that in writing, in doing scholarly writing, I created a different voice, a scholarly speaking voice. But as I return to other forms of creative essay writing and poetry, I'm mindful of the fact that I think she's the only scholar who said to me, your creative writing is important to your intellectual life. She told me the opposite of leave it at the door and learn this new way of speaking. She was really trying to tell me you need to hold on to the voice that you already have. Mm-hmm. So.
Thank you so much for that, Arlene, because there are a lot of graduate students on the line today who are engaging in a tug of war with their intellectual voice, with their creative voice. And many of our panelists have figured out how to merge the two, where it doesn't feel like a tug of war. And so I'm wondering if any of you would like to elaborate on that.
So Arlene is reminding me, I mean, one of the things that Barbara did was she always offered a creative option for her papers, like in the undergraduate literature classroom. And so I think that, you know, and also we never, I mean, this might be dating me in terms of, you know, this might be because of when I was an undergrad. In fact, theory kind of entered the undergraduate classroom between my undergraduate experience and my graduate experience. So in terms of like the primary works that we were looking at. So in Barbara's classroom, we read primary works of literature. And so I came into kind of theory through the works of literature, through the primary works, just like she writes about. And so I think that for me, it was actually, I don't know, like there's almost a part of me that feels like that I was disadvantaged, but she allowed me to like understand that things were possible that then later on, the academy tried to tell me wasn't possible. So then I had to deal with that, right? Like in terms of kind of thinking about like the way that we write is from a place of feeling. And I saw somebody mention, you know, Audre Lorde, the uses of the erotic. But for me in my own work, I mean, I think that that's part of what took me so long to write my first book, right? Because of my training as an undergrad and as a graduate student, because I, you know, came through African American studies, like I couldn't figure out how to fit the way I wanted to write into the boxes that you know, the publishers or the academy or my department wanted. And so for me, it really meant, for me, I was finally able to write the book when I gave myself the permission that Barbara and Veve Clark. And I mean, to come through African American studies in the late 80s and early 90s was a thing. And so I really felt like I had to just remember that voice that I had found through her classes to write the book, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, as I said earlier, I was actually in the audience when she gave that paper, The Race for Theory, in 1986, in late May. And it was a huge conference that two professors in the English department at that time, David Lloyd and Abdul John Muhammad, had convened on the nature and context of minority discourse. And what I think I remember most strongly in hearing her deliver that talk, I mean, what I heard, and I suppose maybe I heard it musically in a way, maybe more even than literary critically, was the moment where she said, and we have always been a race for theory. And what interestingly it illuminated for me was something that I had actually heard the day before, I believe, at that same conference, which was Sylvia Wynter, who was also a speaker at that conference, giving a famous talk that was later published. I think it's called on Disenchanting Discourse. And there was this thing that Sylvia Wynter did. And obviously, you know, people might tend to think of maybe Wynter on one side of the theory divide and you know, and Christian on another side. But there was this thing that Wynter did in the middle of her talk where she started tapping her foot on the floor of Dwinell Auditorium, and you could hear it percussively, you know, all over the auditorium. And she was tapping her foot to the rhythm of her speech. Like she was accompanying herself as she spoke, but her speaking was almost like singing. And what I guess I kind of felt like was that what I had heard in that amazingly brilliant moment as she accompanied herself was then illuminated the next day by the way in which Barbara Christian was talking about theory and talking about us being a race for theory, but also refusing the simplistic opposition between theoretical language and sensual language. So I've never believed, and anybody who actually reads the essay could never believe that it was an essay in which she was against theory. There was a ridiculous essay written by two English professors, Walter Ben Michaels and Stephen Knapp, called Against Theory. That was where the against theory position came from. It was within the English department. What she was asking us to do was to radically reconfigure our understanding of theory so that we not only didn't disassociate it from practice, but also so that we didn't disassociate it from feeling, okay, and from sensual experience.
And I guess I'd just add to that, I think that a lot of my work is perhaps plays in the social sciences and the sort of interaction between the social sciences and the humanities in a particular kind of way. And we're often taught, you know, in social science work to disappear ourselves and to not be there. And I think that part of the lessons that I got from Barbara is that kind of emotional, as Lisa said, that sort of emotional and physical distance from the work is in fact not what works, right? And I think that by learning, you know, creative ways to kind of place myself and engage myself within the text, even when, you know, I'm writing about, you know, something that generally doesn't require that kind of method, is a way for me to bring sensuality, my feelings, and then also to think about other folks' forms of sensuality as I'm writing. So I think there's a way of sensual writing and sensory and sensual writing that you can bring to the work, even when you are writing perhaps, you know, trying to deal with certain kinds of standards that kind of come from the social sciences. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much for adding that, Xavier, because in many ways, you're getting at something that's so important. And that is this whole idea that too often in the academy, we are told that we need to leave our best selves at the door. That is who we are and how we feel. And that Barbara told us, no, that's what makes our work strong. That's what makes our work transformative. So in addition to sensual language, she allowed us to embrace our sensitive side, who we are as sensitive people. And another question that we have dips back into Barbara really pushing us to stretch beyond the expectations of the traditional academy. And Barbara wrote, quote, "I have no set method. I have no set method. Another prerequisite of the new theory, since for me, every work suggests a new approach. As risky as that might seem, it is, I believe, what intelligence means. A tuned sensitivity to that which is alive and therefore cannot be known until it is known." So in the wake of Christian's testimony, how are we called to face or to engage the suspicion around the request for a set method of Black studies, for a set method of theory to engage Black life?
I have been thinking, I just want to acknowledge the ways that thinking about Barbara has brought to mind some of her other Caribbean equivalents, her Caribbean peers. And I want to, in response to that question, Eula, I want to share this quote from Stuart Hall's essay, Cultural Studies and Its Theoretical Legacies, because I think that with Barbara, Hall is really trying to talk about how culture is slippery, right? It's not, we can't wholly put our hands on it. There's always something that escapes. So he writes, "If you work on culture, if culture happens to be what seizes hold of your soul, you have to recognize that you will always be working in an area of displacement. There's always something decentered about the medium of culture, about language, textuality, and signification, which always escapes and evades the attempt to link it directly and immediately with other structures." And so I think that is really, that they're really saying something similar, like this sense that I think some people have tried to take African-American literature and culture and make them instruments in theoretical arguments. Barbara is the person who warns us about doing that, because she's trying to say there's always something that is internal to the work of literature that escapes from its use in a political setting. And that's why I think that her unwillingness to say, I'm going to use the same reading method for a whole set of texts is so important, because the text has its own internal integrity. And so, yes, I think that's one of the things that has been incredibly important to me about Barbara's work and the work of these other scholars in African diaspora studies.
Thank you, Arlene. Anyone else?
I just remember Barbara saying to us, and I'm sorry, Lisa, but just saying to us that, that Black life exceeds the traditional methods, right? The capaciousness of Black life requires a capaciousness and of methods, and so therefore, I just remember her saying that, and I just wanted to add that to Arlene's conversation.
So I'm thinking too, and I'm thinking back to what Fred said about what Barbara's doing with theory. And I think that, like, for me, having come through African American Studies, and then wound up. So I have a joint appointment, but most of my appointment is in English. And I have to say that landing in an English department after being trained in this Department of African American Studies was disorienting, to say the least. And one of the challenges for me was especially working with graduate students in English who carried around like theory, like with the capital T, as like this, as the hammer, right? Like if you think about like theory as a toolbox, it's what it's like. They were like, this is, and like I remember actually asking a graduate student what they were working on, and they named a theory. And I was like, wait, but like what work are you working on? And I think that for me, it has definitely been a challenge in terms of kind of thinking through how do we do this work outside of African American studies? Like how is African American studies done in spaces that are not African American studies or Black studies or diaspora studies, and really trying to get the students to kind of sit with the work first and figure out what is the work theorizing, right? And so I always, and in fact, kind of thinking about how I teach and how the way that Barbara taught informs the way that I teach. This past semester was the first semester, because we were in an online format, that I taught a grad course primarily with theoretical texts, because they were easy. Like I didn't want the students to have to like figure out how to get books and all of that. And so I taught the race for theory, and it was like what Xavier was saying. It was like this aha. I was like, oh, that's why I think the way I think, and that's why I write the way I write, and that's why I talk the way I talk. And so it was useful for me. And I was like, okay, so now I need to use this when I teach graduate students, because that essay does the work for me in a lot of ways. When I did not lie about the day-to-day parenting. So I think, for me, in terms of kind of like how, like theory has its place, but to kind of understand that like theory doesn't always look the way that you think it looks like, and then also kind of hand in hand with me, this struggle for me in terms of teaching literature. I teach literature primarily, and then I also teach a course on Black women's histories in the US, is that for so many students at the undergraduate level, this is their first time encountering these histories and these literatures. And it's another layer to also want, and I think this again goes against kind of the ways outside of Black studies that we think about. I'm thinking what Lee just said earlier in your introduction, in terms of like, kind of like, what's at stake in terms of like Black humanity, is that that when undergrad students come into my class, a lot of professors like, I don't care, I don't want to know what you feel about this work, I don't want to know how it makes you feel. But I'm like, you can't figure out what the work is theorizing unless until after you've actually been able to like read and sit and feel this work. And so it's just a lot of work that has to happen, it's really hard to do outside of African American studies, outside of the Black studies classroom. So this is what my students deal with. I know I went in a lot of different directions, but there you are.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I think in many ways, what I'm also hearing goes back to Barbara in terms of when she talked about her fear is what happens when theory is not rooted in practice. And so I'm wondering if some of you can talk about how you root theory in your practice, in your writing, in your creative work. Xavier?
Okay, sure. Sorry. I mean, I think part of it is, I think part of it is in trying to, from my perspective, at least with my work, is to kind of use the work and the voices and the narratives and the stories, because I am an ethnographer. of the people that I'm interviewing and talking to as the basis of the theory in some ways, right? To think about the things that that people are saying in their narrative. So in a similar way that I think Barbara asked us to really think about the narrative of literature, right? And literary text as a basis for us to think about. I think I try to do the same as well when it comes to the stories of the folks that I encounter and the participation that I have in community life, right? And so that's both just literally my day-to-day lived community life, but also when I'm doing my ethnographic work and I'm participating in community life, right? I'm living with folks, and to think about those moments as spaces of bringing of really making that connection between theory and praxis. So I think that's my approach. But I definitely would love to think a little bit more slightly undeveloped, but that's where I would start.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
One class that I began teaching that I think brings together some different approaches to using narrative in the context of theory is a class on critical race theory and African-American literature, a graduate class that I taught partly because I wanted to think about the ways that critical race theory had taken up narrative as a way of centering theory and thinking about that in relationship to the theoretical force within African-American literature. So for me, that was a way of making something clear to graduate students who were not primarily in African-American studies, that the way that narrative, as one of the earlier panelists spoke to, I think Xavier, that how important narrative has been to the articulation of African-American cultural and material life. So that was one practice in which I was trying to bring those things together.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit and engage Barbara in the classroom, because what is clear from so many of the comments from people who registered for our conversation is that some people only had one class with Barbara Christian, and it was transformative. And I don't know if it was the weight of her voice. I know that the weight of her voice would force me to push my shoulders back a little bit during faculty meetings. Okay. But Lachelle Blackmore, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor here at Cal and graduated in 1989, states, quote, "I took one course with her and she taught me how to ask tough questions and seek the truth. And seek the truth." And I wanted to go to truth telling and the whole idea that one of the primary missions of Black studies is to seek multiple truths, right? And how in many ways it is our truth telling that I think places us a little bit differently than some of the more quote traditional departments. And another reason why we have been placed a little differently from other traditional departments is because in many ways, the field of Black studies has never not been at a critical juncture. It remains, the icebreaker ship, charting paths forward, always looking in multiple directions, right? We look at the past to imagine our Black futures. And in many ways, at the most foundational level, Barbara Christian's work, Black studies as a field, right? We do it, in the words of Barbara Christian, in order to save our own life. So what does it mean for all of you to have been writing in this field over the years? And how do you see the field as one of feeling and pushing past survival and onto thriving? So I'm wondering if you all can talk a little bit about how the field of Black Studies and your work in it has been about preserving who you are as you create transformative knowledge for us as a field. I know my questions are multi-layered. I'm hoping you could just take any little piece of it that speaks to your soul.
I think this may be an idiosyncratic response to your question, Eula, but as I think back on Barbara's pedagogy, one of the things, so I'm not one of those people who took one of Barbara's classes. Barbara at one point thought I had been her TA because I sat in on every one of her undergraduate classes in addition to being her graduate student. So I was always there. And one of the reasons I was always there is because, like many people who entered graduate school, I started graduate school in 1990. So I had read quite a lot of African-American literature, but I had never studied it because in the 80s in college, there were very few opportunities to formally study African-American literature. So one of the things I just want to emphasize is, along with everything else we've said about Barbara, was her vast knowledge of African-American literary history. I mean, she knew things about Black literary history that I think very few other people knew because she had spent so much time gathering that knowledge and really understanding, you know, as she said so often, if literature is not written about, it disappears. And so the work of constantly unearthing, again, these writers who might have been quite well known in their time, but disappeared because there was not a critical apparatus that kept their work in view. So I want to point to that, like just her incredible knowledge and the sense that trying to insist when I'm teaching on my expectation that students read as much as they possibly can. And that that what we can say about the literature or culture should to some degree be conditioned on what we actually know about it. Right? There are things that have disappeared from view and that we are constantly having to go back and bring back into view because of the way much work in this field has historically been archived and treated within a wider literary establishment.
Thank you.
I think one of the really great contributions that she made as a critic was she wrote lots of reviews of contemporary literature. She was paying attention to what the writers of her moment were actually doing. And some of her, you know, most insightful and sort of rich, you know, sort of literary critical insights emerge in those moments of what I guess you would, you know, be tempted to call a more immediate response to work. I'm thinking of her review of this great novel by Cara Olivia Herron called Thereafter Johnny. Her review of Jane Cortez's selected poems. Those these moments where she's kind of initiating the question of how to read those books, not closing that question off, not trying to say that there's only one way, but opening up a kind of field of approach to those books that that I think, you know, are really important in the sense that they kind of help to establish the conditions under which those books will remain alive and remain available. And the other thing I guess I would say, and I think this is connected to that, is well, like in the passage from the beautiful essay she wrote on Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf that I read, you know, it really takes the form of a letter to Morrison. And so there's this sense that she's speaking back to those writers, sort of holding them in engaging them in a conversation with readers that allows them to notice somebody's actually reading their work, you know. And I think that's great. And it also is very adventurous the way that she does it, because the form that letter to Morrison takes is the making of a fiction about Morrison's engagement with Virginia Woolf. She's like writing a letter to Morrison that imagines what Morrison must have been thinking when she was writing her thesis on Virginia Woolf at Cornell. And it's just kind of amazing audaciousness. But it's at the same time that there's audacity, there's also, and I hope this is the right word, a kind of humility. You know, a sense of what it means to be, you know, in service to the writer and to her work. And so what it produces is this amazing feedback loop that then you as Christians reader can be involved in. And I think it's really telling that she uses the word chorus. And I think it's also really telling that she talks about her literary critical work as a kind of fiction. And really, I realized going back looking at that today that, I mean, you know, one of the most compelling works of cultural criticism in our current moment was, you know, Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which is in some sense defined by this notion that she has of a kind of critical fabulation. And I thought, and this is in no way to diminish Hartman's achievement or the innovation that she engages in. But I was like, man, Barbara Christian was doing critical fabulation in 1994 as a mode of literary critical work in her engagement with Morrison, you know? And so, and what it just allows you to do is, and she even uses the same term that Hartman uses, which is chorus, to describe this feedback loop, this choir. You know, and it's just a beautiful thing when your mind can range not only from the chorus that Woolf and Morrison, you know, combined to form, and then Hartman's in that chorus. But then my grandmother and the women she sang with at Mount Olive Methodist Church in Fordyce, Arkansas, they're in that choir, you know. So that's an amazing achievement, you know.
Anyone else? Well, I want to take a minute to recognize some other folks on the line. We have Mike Williams with us. And Mike Williams is so important for the Department of African American Studies. His financial support has really helped to elevate our ability to do what we want to do. So we are so thankful for your support, and we are thankful that you are here with us. I realize I only have 5 minutes, so I thought it would be at least, it would be important for me to let our speakers, perhaps if any of you have a question or a last comment that you want to share, I want to give you the opportunity to do so. Well, I guess many of you are thinking, we have done a lot of talking, Eula. Okay. And I have to say, as we put closure, I want to conclude our program today by reminding all of you that our next critical conversation will happen on February 15th, which is President's Day. President's Day. But we are going to be here, President's Day, and we are going to be here with social activist, poet, and novelist, Miss Alice Walker. And her name has been brought up quite a bit today. So I'm thinking all of you will want to join us on February 15th to have a conversation with Miss Alice Walker. All of you are also going to receive a follow-up message with details about our next event. You will also receive details on opportunities to support the Barbara Christian Memorial Fund, which exclusively supports our graduate students and our undergraduate majors. Finally, the forum will allow you to add additional reflections about today. And because I am a historian, all of this will be archived. And this will be an archive that we won't have to critique, okay? Lastly, I just want to say, if you have a spiritual practice or a cultural practice of pouring a libation for an ancestor, I want to encourage you to do that this evening for Professor Barbara Christian. It is my most sincere hope that our conversation today has given you multiple reasons why she should be remembered. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on February 15th.